How often have you decided to totally transform your life, to reinvent yourself, only to find a few weeks later that you are back to your old self and to your old patterns? It is so frustrating to have that resolution, that commitment, that energy, and to fall back onto your own habits. What if it were actually possible to change it around this time once and for all and to stick to these new patterns? And what can you do differently to ensure that change will actually stick? In this episode, we're going to explore, first of all, why success is built upon our internal identity and why first we need an internal transformation in order to have external transformation. And then we'll go through the 7 steps to create identity change, because identity shift is the most powerful way to change your entire life. Why is it that external results come primarily from an internal change, an internal shift? This is because we can't take actions towards certain goals if we don't believe that it's even possible. Think about it for a minute. If you want to be really fit, but deep down you don't believe that you have the discipline to exercise regularly, or you don't believe that you would ever be good in exercising, and therefore before even taking action you block yourself because you don't believe you could even take that action. So if you don't take actions, then you don't get the results. What started was that internal belief. That was a very simple example with exercising, but this is valid in all areas, everything we do in life. We don't see that there's this invisible block between what we're thinking and then the actions we take. We prevent ourselves from even seeing certain opportunities, certain possible actions, because deep down we don't believe that we're worthy of them. We don't believe that it's possible for us. We don't believe that we deserve it. And because we have all these internal thoughts and beliefs, we don't even see the actions that we could take sometimes, or we don't even take them. Why is it that so many people are struggling to set up their own business, are struggling to become healthily, to find a new relationship? It's not because the actions are that difficult per se. It's because seeing these actions and believing we can take these actions requires a huge amount of awareness, discipline, self-belief. And if we don't have that to begin with, how can we possibly make progress on these given actions? So it all works like this. The model is the thoughts dictate our beliefs, because a belief is only a thought that you have over and over again. And from this belief, you take action, and these actions lead to significant results and outcome in your life. So it's thoughts, beliefs, actions, results. And if you're able to shift your way of thinking and shift your beliefs that are built both from your internal thoughts and from you see externally, from your external experience, if you're able to shift your thoughts and beliefs, then you will start to take more actions that are aligned, and this will lead to results and outcome in your life. The question to ask yourself when you're not seeing your goals being realized, when you're not seeing the results that you want in your life, is to ask yourself, what are the actions that you're not taking? And then go one step further and ask yourself, what belief or thought is preventing you from taking these actions? And very often you will find that there's fear, that there's discomfort, that there's uncertainty, that there's a lack of self-belief. And that's where the real work begins. Once you go down that rabbit hole, down that alley, ask yourself, what are some of the thoughts and beliefs that are preventing you from making progress in your life and in your goals? So this is why internal reality leads to external reality, because what you believe, what you think, all leads to the actions that you take, and that become regular habits and behaviors, and this leads to results and goals. One way you can do this is to look at certain people that you admire, that you feel are very successful. Maybe it's in business, maybe it's in sport, maybe it's in other areas that you admire them for, and look at what are the goals they have specifically achieved. Maybe it's, growing a great audience if they're building a business. Maybe it's Olympic athlete. Look at the goals they've achieved. Look at what actions are required in order to achieve that goal. Very often they'll share how many hours they put in, how much they worked on their craft or their skill. And so you can start to see what are the actions required in order to get to those results, and then go one step back and ask yourself, what are some of the beliefs and thoughts that they had in order to be able to do those actions? because it requires a certain mindset, a certain way of thinking in order to take those actions. And this leads us now to the 7 steps of identity shift, because that really is that first step. That first step is, who do you need to become in order to achieve that goal? And this can come from admiring and looking at other people who have achieved similar goals as you and wondering, what have they done? But also intuitively asking yourself, who do you need to be to run a 6-7-figure business? Who do you need to be in order to be very fit? Who do you need to be in order to be a great partner with someone? Who do you need to be in terms of your values, in terms of your identity, in terms of who and how you think, in terms of the actions you take on a regular basis? Having that very, very clear picture of how you want to show up in the world, not once, not twice, but consistently every single day. And this is that first step. Who do you need to become in order to achieve that goal? Once you're really clear on this, this will help you to tailor the second step, which is your input. And your input is your input in terms of the environment. This means, what sort of podcasts do you listen to? What sort of YouTube channels do you watch? What sort of books do you read? And each time you're about to read a new book, listen to a podcast, check if it's aligned with the person you want to become. What will happen is, once you start to tailor and be more clear and be more consistent in the sort of content that you're consuming, it will change your way of thinking. We have all evolved to adapt to our peer group, to the people around us. We're social beings. If you're constantly plugged into Tony Robbins and Alex Hormozi and Diary of a CEO, maybe my channel too, if you're listening to all these people all the time, versus if you're binge watching celebrities or reality TV or the news, this will totally alter what you think about, how you think about things, your perspective on life, what you believe is possible and not possible, because subconsciously you start to absorb other people's beliefs, other people's ways of thinking, other people's abundance mindset. What I realized from listening to certain podcasts, people like Stephen Bartlett, people like Ali Abdaal, all these different people, what I started to realize is I started to think in similar ways to them. I started to take on their beliefs, their perspective, their ways of looking at the world or at business. And this can really support you if the people you're listening to have achieved goals that you aspire to. So in my case, I aspire to grow my audience in similar ways to Ali Abdaal and Stephen Bartlett. So if I'm listening to them and they've achieved that goal, I get to see the way they think, which helps me to tailor my own way of thinking and my own actions so I can act accordingly and achieve that goal. Makes sense? We absorb what we listen to. It's such a privilege nowadays, if you think about it, to have access to all this information that can help us to shift our way of thinking, our way of behaving. 100, 200 years ago, if you wanted to change your whole life around, you didn't have that many opportunities unless you happened to have someone around you, close to you, family or friend, who had achieved that goal, and then they could inspire you. Nowadays, you just need to decide who is it you want to become, for which specific goal and why it's important, and then look at who around you has achieved it that really inspires you, and just tune in, absorb like a sponge. Adam Grant talks about being a sponge when it comes to learning. You absorb all the learning, and then you change and you alter your way of looking at the world and the way you take action. And this leads us to our third steps, which is writing down for your new identity very clearly your beliefs, your attitude, the habits you're taking on, the behaviors, and making equally a list of all the attitude, habits, behaviors, beliefs that you do not want to have anymore. And I'll give you an example. There were a lot of things that I was doing in my personal life that looked good on paper, that were aligned with my new identity, such as exercising every day and meditating and starting with my most important task at work. But at one point I realized the behavior was aligned with the new identity, but my attitude wasn't. I noticed in my attitude a bit of negativity, a bit of pessimism, a bit of lack of self-belief. And then I asked myself, how can I show up differently? How can I shift my attitude to be more positive, to be more hopeful, to be more energized? And what I realized was, coming back to that second point about input, is if as I walk to work in the morning, I listened for half an hour to a podcast that was really energizing for me, or great topic, or super interesting, it set the mood and it set the tone for the day. I was pre-framing my brain for the day ahead and putting it in that right mood, right perspective, and it gave me that energy. I used to think that I'd prefer to walk without listening to anything to be more mindful, which I believe is very important, and I do that very often. Yet I thought just in the morning as I commute for half an hour, and if you don't have a commute, you can just have a morning walk, 20 minutes, half an hour around the block, and listening to something that is energizing and motivating and that is interesting and gets me curious and re-energized about what I do, that was sufficient to shift my attitude. So this is what we're talking about. When you write down your new identity with your core beliefs, attitude, behaviors, habits, start to check what's aligned, what's not aligned, and what are some new behaviors you can put in place that is a good fit, that are a good fit for your new identity and for the goals that you want to achieve. Once you do that, what you will notice is that's the fourth step. You will notice a gap. You will see a gap between your old identity and the new identity. This gap can be, for instance, certain ways of thinking start to shift, certain actions you didn't used to take and now you're taking regularly, and you see a sort of mismatch, and you will feel a resistance from your old identity, from your old self, to bring you back down. The old self will, its ego, it will cling, and it will try to get you back to those old ways of thinking, those old habits, those old attitude, old behaviors. That's why probably in the past, just like I struggled also to shift my identity and behavior, I'm sure you've experienced that. And that's because we just bounce back. We try for a bit, it gets too uncomfortable, there's too much resistance, and then we start sleeping in again. And then we go back to skipping the gym every second day, and we just sort of shift back. And for me, it took several attempts of changing back and forth and pushing through that initial resistance with this. When there's this gap between your old self and new self, you push through that resistance, and then you get to actually make that stick, actually make that new habit or that new behavior stick. Once you have practiced going back and forth, at some point, your brain catches on and think, oh, okay, this is what we're doing now. Oh, now we wake up early and we exercise. Okay, it was new for a bit, but now I'm getting used to it, and I get to see this is how we function now. It's exactly the same with your thought processes, your beliefs, your overall attitude. All of this will shift once you fully push through that initial resistance that there is. What can help you is to be aware there will be a resistance. I think very often in the past, when I decided I'm going to change my whole life and it's a new me and it's a new year, I decided that it would be easy. Just as of tomorrow, I'll exercise an hour a day. That never worked because I didn't anticipate that there would be that resistance and that pushback. So I went in all naive and excited and energized, and a week later, I was back in my old patterns, or 2 weeks later. What I then did was, start small. If you're never exercising and you decide to do an hour every day, you're making it very hard and very unlikely for it to stick, though it's possible, but it's less likely and you're making it a lot harder on yourself. What I did instead was start small and gradually shift that belief and changed what I was willing to tolerate. So I decided I wasn't willing to tolerate anymore not exercising, for instance. So I made it sort of mandatory in my mind, as sort of kind of an obligation, but in a good way, something I was excited about and committed to. Okay, so that was noticing the gap, which is the fourth step. And then the fifth step is to start taking massive action. If you don't take any action, you can't possibly make progress in anything. And while you're making action, start to notice, how is this impacting your goal? How is it impacting your new identity? If you don't take any action, nothing will ever change. But the initial work needs to be done beforehand, right? That's why we first look at shifting the way you think, what you believe, your behaviors, because then when that's in place and you have a stronger belief in yourself, in this new person, then it's easier from that place to take that massive action. But they sort of feed each other. So we want to do them both at the same time. Consistently reaffirm the sort of person you want to become, and at the same time, Take action every single day because consistency builds up. It's all about consistency, not about intensity. And each time you're taking a new action, as James Clear says, you're casting a vote for the sort of person you want to become. So the action helps to build the identity, and the new identity helps to build that action. And it's this virtuous loop, and it helps you to grow and helps you to turn into the person that you want to become. As you take your massive actions, notice once more if there's some resistance, and make sure that these actions are actually aligned with who you want to become and with the goal that you want to achieve. Step 6 is to track your progress. Track your progress along the way when you take these actions, because it's so easy to think that we're not making any progress at all and to get discouraged and to hit a plateau where we feel nothing is really improving. Instead, if you start to track your progress, the actions you're taking, the results that you're seeing, even if it's just small baby steps, this will help you to stay encouraged and to stay motivated because you are constantly seeing this improvement. For instance, in my case, I track all the bold actions that I take every month, and I have them all in a Notion template. I also have a WhatsApp channel with myself called KT Wins, where I track all the wins and celebrations for each day, every time something positive happens, to help me to stay motivated, stay on track, and to believe that the actions that I'm taking are also paying off. And last but not least, step 7, which is absolutely crucial when you're doing an identity shift, is to constantly level up. Because the new identity that you're now building might be old by the time in 6 months or in a year's time. When you've decided now who you want to become and you start to transform your life, maybe you start to exercise regularly, or maybe you finally launch that business, or you're starting to grow your business and you're changing the way you're leading your company or your team. Once you start to change things around and you start to see improvement, maybe after 3 months or 6 months, check in again, see how does it align with who you wanted to become, and then place the bar further. This is a typical high achiever way of thinking. And in this channel and in this podcast, I often talk about being a high achiever and how that can make us unhappy. So it's a fine balance between still feeling fulfilled and happy for who you've become, and at the same time, you increase your standard. For instance, the last 6 months plus 8 months, I've exercised every day, some days with light stretch and yoga, and other days with Pilates or run or workout. And then at one point I realized, well, that's fine, but I'm not really seeing an increase in progress in my length of running, for example, or in the quality of my workouts. So I just leveled up. I just made everything a notch harder. Now that I'd proved to myself I could be consistent and exercise every day, I thought, okay, consistency is fine. Now let's level up one extra step and just make everything a bit harder. Not crazy, because the aim, in my case anyway, is to be healthy and fit, and I don't want to burn out physically or mentally. So I'm constantly balancing how healthy is it for me. But exercise is healthy, but we need to increase it gradually. Otherwise, you can injure yourself or burn out. So it's a matter of leveling up, but strategically and healthily. We want to be consistent and not intense, because intensity doesn't work. So consistent, and then level up. And then we continue consistency. And if you realize that you've leveled up too hard and you're not being able to be consistent, then you want to bring it down a notch so it's still manageable. We always want to have that fine balance between something that's very challenging, but at the same time that's still manageable. Because if it's not challenging enough, you're not growing or pushing yourself. But if it's not manageable, you'll just stop. And you need to know yourself and start to understand, in terms of your own awareness, what is the next step in terms of challenge, and is it actually still feasible and doable? Because as high achievers, I'm sure you know, you end up pushing the bar way too high, and then maybe that isn't actually feasible. So want it high, but doable. And once you realize it's a bit too much in the comfort zone, level up. It's what Stephen Covey in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People says when he says, sharpen the saw, which is habit 7. And that's all about leveling up. So those were the 7 steps to create a total identity shift. And it's so important to remember what I said about that gap between your old self and your new self, and feeling that discrepancy, because that will lead to that resistance, which is why we struggle so much to turn things around. But if you're really, really clear on what you want your life to look like, what goals this means you can put in place, and then who do you need to become in order to achieve those goals, looking around you at people who've achieved them, and how do they act, how do they think, how do they behave, absorb all that content all the time. You're sort of brainwashing yourself to think differently, commit to that change, and then take those daily actions. You can absolutely reinvent yourself. You can absolutely change the way you think, put these new habits in place, put these new behaviors in place. Doesn't mean it'll be easy, but it is absolutely doable because we've all done it before. I'm sure you had moments in your life where you have changed things around, where you have pivoted your life. Learn from those moments too. Ask yourself, what did you do there? What helps? Probably a mix of someone around you or something you listened to inspired you. There was a tipping point where you decided it was time for that change. So you're fully committed. You started putting new behaviors in place. You started to think differently. You tracked your progress. You took massive action. And then on the other side, you've even forgotten what your old self used to think or believe or how they used to act, because now you're totally changed the way you show up. And this is what we want, at least for certain areas in certain ways in our life, because that's how you create change. That's how you create transformation. And this can lead to fulfillment, especially if there are areas that you're frustrated or unhappy about. I hope this has been useful for you. I fundamentally believe that external results are a mirror of our internal reality. So the more we can shift things inside of us, the more we can transform our own psychology, our own behaviors and beliefs, and the way we see the world, the easier it then is to have external results and transformation in our life. If this was useful, please write a comment or like below. My name is Katie Stoddart. I'm a conscious leadership coach, speaker, and podcaster. If this has been useful, share with someone, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for tuning in, and see you in the next episode.